In the chilled foyer, a fresh newspaper lay on the floor, dated October 25, 2030, even though outside the windows, April of 2026 was barely beginning to bloom. The sheets of paper did not rustle from the draft, they pulsed, as if a living heart beat beneath the printing ink, pushing out rhythmic waves of heat. An obituary for the current owner of the mansion was printed on the front page, describing his death from respiratory failure exactly 15 minutes after the first heir crossed the threshold of the house. A strange scent of formaldehyde and old paper filled the space, displacing the oxygen, and the heavy oak doors behind the visitor slammed shut without any outside help, severing the sunlight and the sounds of the living world. The air inside felt dense, like stagnant water in a deep well where time had turned into a thick suspension. The gaze involuntarily caught the clock on the wall, whose hands moved backward, counting down the moments to a point already recorded in tomorrow's newspaper. Fear did not come immediately, it seeped through the soles of the shoes along with the cold of the marble slabs, forcing the air to freeze in the middle of the vast hall. Every movement was accompanied by an echo that returned with a delay of several seconds, as if the house were digesting the sound of footsteps before allowing them to dissolve into the void. The heir stood at the center of this architectural madness, realizing that his presence here had been predicted and documented long before his birth. The walls of the foyer were draped in dark silk, which upon closer inspection seemed woven from millions of the finest hairs. The fabric shuddered when a person passed by, reacting to body heat like a predatory plant reacts to a flying insect. In the corners beneath the ceiling, shadows gathered that did not obey the laws of optics, they thickened where there should have been light and melted in the darkest niches. A dull thud echoed from deep within the house, sounding like the fall of a heavy body, followed by a silence so absolute that the ringing of blood in one's own ears became audible. It was the sound of an invitation into a labyrinth from which no one had yet returned to confirm its existence. The newspaper on the floor suddenly burst into a cold blue flame, leaving no ash, only a scorched smudge in the shape of a human palm on the expensive rug. The text of the obituary now burned in the memory like a brand from a searing iron, confirming that time was running out. The heir's legs carried him deeper into the corridor, past portraits of ancestors whose pupils had been gouged out with surgical precision. Each step vibrated through his bones, as if the house were not merely a structure, but a colossal mechanism set into motion by the single touch of a doorknob. Ahead stretched a suite of rooms vanishing into infinity, where perspective distorted, making the doorways appear now too narrow for a human, now gigantic, as if for beings from other dimensions. The smell of decay mingled with the scent of fresh-cut lilies, creating a stifling atmosphere of a funeral home operating as a perpetual motion machine. No one came to meet the guest, not a single living soul disturbed the peace of this place, but the feeling of a stranger's intent gaze made the skin crawl. There were exactly 100 rooms in the mansion, and each was waiting for its victim to fill the void within the walls with new content, a new story, a new nightmare made reality. The first door on the right was ajar, exposing a sliver of absolute darkness from which the steady ticking of thousands of invisible mechanisms drifted. This was not the sound of clocks, rather, it resembled the work of a massive loom, weaving the threads of fate into a complex and terrifying pattern. The air touched the wood, and it felt warm like human flesh, quivering with internal tension. At that moment, he realized that the obituary in the newspaper was not a warning, but a statement of a fact that had already occurred in the mind of the house itself. 15 minutes had turned into an eternity compressed to the size of a single breath, and this breath was to be the final act of will before the mansion swallowed its prey whole. A strange glow began to emanate from the walls, illuminating veins pulsating beneath the layer of plaster and old wallpaper. The house was coming alive, awakening from a long slumber caused by the death of its former master, and it now demanded a new heart to sustain life within its 100 rooms. Every detail of the interior, from the crystal chandelier to the legs of the chairs, was part of this singular design aimed at keeping time captive. The heir took another step, feeling reality behind his back begin to crumble into grey dust. There was no longer a way back, there was only the road forward, through halls of obsession and immured secrets, toward a date that had not yet arrived in the world of the living. The path through the first act of this stone prison wound past halls that had become monuments to madness, where the very architecture served as an instrument to suppress the will. Dusty carpets swallowed the sound of footsteps, but in return, they gave back a strange, barely perceptible echo, resembling the whispers of hundreds of voices trapped within the walls. In the 10th room, thousands of glass eyes from stuffed rare birds followed every movement of the guest. Their frozen beaks seemed parted in a silent scream that felt as though it might break through the veil of time at any moment. These were not merely hunting trophies, but frozen instants of terror, torn from nature and arranged in a strict, frightening order along endless shelves of ebony. In the next gallery, led to by a narrow and stifling corridor, hundreds of knives hung on the walls, arranged in a strict geometric order, with the blades pointed exactly toward the center of the room. There, on the floor, beneath a single dim light source, old brown stains were visible, which even the most thorough cleaning by time could not erase. For decades, the owner had collected instruments of pain and symbols of frozen life, turning the living space into a grand crypt for his own fears and obsessions. Every blade, from the thinnest scalpel to a heavy machete, held upon its steel a reflection of the madness of the one who had once decided to subjugate the very essence of suffering. The heir felt the weight of these objects pressing upon his shoulders, forcing him to breathe faster, though the air in the mansion remained motionless and dead. Each new door opened another page of this nightmare encyclopedia, where the halls turned into thematic shrines of human destructiveness. In the 13th room, dried flowers rested under glass domes, gathered, judging by the labels, during the days of the most massive catastrophes of the 20th century. In the 40th room, orderly rows of empty poison vials shimmered in the gloom, like the ghostly teeth of an unknown beast ready to snap its jaws shut on the throat of anyone who dared disturb their eternal rest. The walk through this museum of pathologies caused physical rejection, yet an unknown force compelled his legs to move further, deeper into the bowels of the house, where the concentration of madness reached its peak. The 54th room was entirely filled with old mechanical dolls whose springs had long since rusted, but whose porcelain faces retained an expression of infinite, time-frozen astonishment. As soon as the heir passed them, one of the dolls jerked its hand, emitting a dry screech of metal against metal, and this sound pierced the silence of the mansion like a whip crack. It seemed the mansion was awakening with every new door opened, absorbing the energy of a living person to activate its dead mechanisms. Halls succeeded one another, turning into an endless kaleidoscope of perverted hobbies, where collecting became a form of slow and methodical self-destruction. In one room stood hundreds of aquariums filled not with fish, but with thick black resin, inside which insects were frozen in bizarre poses, their shells shimmering with all the colors of the rainbow under the artificial light. The owner of the mansion clearly sought to stop any process of change, to preserve life in its strangest and most frightening manifestations. It was a trap house, where every space was designed to strip the visitor of their sense of reality and replace it with the eternal contemplation of static agony. By the end of the second act of this strange journey, the heir realized that the collections were merely a screen, an external manifestation of something much deeper and more sinister hidden in the very foundation of the building. The knives, the taxidermy, and the poison served only as decorations for a ritual that had lasted here for many decades, preparing the ground for a final transformation. With every hall, the walls seemed to grow thinner, and the sounds behind them more distinct, though the mind refused to believe what it heard behind the tightly closed oak doors. This was not just a collector's house, but a living archive of pain that demanded constant renewal and the fresh gaze of one still capable of feeling real, unadulterated horror. As he passed the 60th room, the space around him began to change noticeably, losing the features of a familiar dwelling and acquiring a resemblance to an endless surgical block or an alchemist's laboratory. The lighting became a sickly yellow, and the smell of formaldehyde intensified so much that his eyes began to water, hiding the outlines of objects in a misty haze. In the center of this madness stood a massive organ whose pipes were crafted from human bones, and although no one sat at the keyboard, the instrument emitted a barely audible low-frequency hum. This sound resonated in the heir's chest, tuning his heartbeat to a new rhythm, alien to biological nature, dictated by the walls of this cursed place. Every object in this mansion had its own story, written in blood and fastened with the seal of madness, and now all these stories sought to merge into one common symphony. The knives on the walls began to vibrate in unison with the organ, and the glass eyes of the bird seemed to fill with a living glint, reflecting the fear-distorted face of the new owner. The crypt for fears was turning into a prison for the soul, where each room was a separate cell intended for the eternal storage of a single emotion. The heir understood that he was not just inspecting an inheritance, but undergoing an inventory procedure, becoming part of the collection, the most valuable and final exhibit in this grand assembly of horrors. Ahead lay the most terrifying halls, those that were reliably hidden from the eyes of outsiders and even the closest servants, those where the owner's madness took its most pure and undistorted forms. Step by step, through rows of instruments of pain and frozen bodies, he approached that invisible boundary beyond which ordinary human logic ceased to exist. The mansion breathed down the back of his neck, directing his movement with the help of shadows and sounds that could no longer be ignored or dismissed as a figment of the imagination. The stone prison was preparing to reveal its true essence, opening the doors to the cellars where the foot of no living being who had retained their sanity had ever stepped before. The silence that reigned after another door slammed shut was heavy, like a tombstone, and in this silence, the heir heard his own voice, though his lips remained tightly sealed. The voice came from behind the next door. It was reading a list of names, among which his own name stood first, pronounced with a frightening tenderness. This was the final confirmation that he had fallen into a trap created not by a man, but by time itself, which had decided to incarnate in the stone and wood of this house. Every room now seemed like the open mouth of a giant monster, patiently waiting for the moment when the prey would step of its own accord into its infinite gullet, lined with sharp knives and bone pipes. By midday, the heir discovered that the layout of the house was entirely devoid of common sense, obeying only the laws of a delirium frozen in stone. Space began to warp, turning into a topological trap where corridors could lead to nowhere or return to the same point, but with frightening alterations in the interior details. 37 doors were not merely locked, but completely immured from the inside with crude brickwork, the traces of which looked disturbingly fresh, as if the mortar had set only moments ago. The red brick clashed with the otherwise exquisite decor of the mansion, resembling bleeding wounds on the building's body that someone had hastily and roughly tried to stitch up to hide the internal rot. Attempts to listen to what was happening behind these walls brought only the realization of a rhythmic scratching, as if someone on the other side were trying to claw their way out with fingernails. This sound was dry and persistent. It did not cease for a second, creating the sensation that being stripped of their voices but retaining a mad will for liberation were imprisoned behind the brick barriers. The heir pressed his ear to the cold surface, and it seemed he could feel a faint vibration of the stone responding to the beats of his own heart. The scratching grew louder when he lingered by the doors too long, as if the prisoners felt the presence of living warmth and redoubled their efforts, striving to break through the obstruction. Each open door, in contrast, led to a new obsession, turning the movement through the house into a plunge into someone else's subconscious, full of painful imagery. In one of the rooms, packed to the very ceiling with thousands of pairs of worn children's shoes, there was a smell of old leather and dust that caused bouts of nausea. The footwear was neatly sorted by color and size, forming bizarre mountains that threatened to collapse and bury anyone who entered. There was no explanation for where such a quantity of items came from or what happened to their owners, but the silence in this hall felt particularly sinister, filled with the invisible presence of those who once wore these tiny boots. The next hall met him with a monotonous noise produced by hundreds of working metronomes arranged on long black tables. They all ticked in perfect unison, creating a powerful hypnotic rhythm that instantly synchronized with the rising pulse of the uninvited guest. It seemed that time itself in this room had acquired physical density, striking the eardrums and forcing thoughts to move in step with the pendulums. An attempt to stop even one of them resulted in all the others beginning to move faster, like a single organism protecting its integrity from external interference. The heir hurried to leave, feeling his own breathing become mechanical and alien. The strangeness of the layout also lay in the fact that windows in these halls were either entirely absent or opened into internal light wells where, instead of the sky, only bare brick walls were visible. Sunlight did not penetrate here, and the sole source of illumination was gas jets that flared up on their own as a person approached. In room number 73, he discovered a collection of human shadows, skillfully cut from black paper and pasted to the walls in poses of extreme despair. These flat figures seemed more alive than the material objects around them. They appeared to stir on the periphery of vision, trying to tear themselves away from the plane and gain volume in this realm of frozen nightmares. The owner of the mansion clearly sought to catalogue not only the material world but also the finest movements of the human psyche, capturing them in the most absurd and frightening forms. Halls succeeded each other, showcasing rooms filled only with broken mirrors in which the reflection fragmented into thousands of shards, stripping a person of their wholeness. Or rooms where thousands of keys hung from the ceiling on invisible fishing lines, none of which fit the immured doors, creating an illusion of choice where total predestination had long reigned. Every step on the creaking parquet was a step deeper into the trap, where common sense failed before the grandiosity and consistency of this mad design. Particularly terrifying was the transition between the east and west wings, where the corridor suddenly narrowed to such an extent that one had to walk sideways, shoulders touching the cold walls. Here, the walls were upholstered in a soft material resembling skin, and at every touch, they emitted a quiet sigh, like the final exhale of the dying. In this narrow space, the air felt a bout of acute claustrophobia, intensified by the realization that behind the soft upholstery might lurk those very immured spaces with the scratching entities. It felt as if the house were contracting, trying to crush him in its embrace like an unwanted foreign body accidentally caught in the well-oiled mechanism of eternal suffering. When he finally emerged into a spacious hall with a collection of astrolabes pointed at non-existent constellations, his sense of reality finally deserted him. All the instruments showed different data, yet none of them corresponded to Earth time or coordinates, hinting that the mansion had long been drifting in another dimension. In the center of the hall stood a glass sphere inside which a model of the house itself slowly rotated, with the 37 rooms highlighted in an ominous red light. Watching this model, the heir noticed a tiny dot moving in one of the unlocked rooms, exactly duplicating his own movements, confirming a total loss of privacy and will. Claustrophobia was replaced by apathy as he realized the scale of the game he had been involved in against his desire. The obsessions of the old master were not merely the whims of a wealthy madman, they were fragments of a code programming the reality within these walls. Every pair of shoes, every metronome, and every knife served as anchors holding the house in a state of eternal now, preventing the past from leaving and the future from arriving. The immured doors were fuses, holding back the pressure of those versions of reality that did not fit the overall picture but continued to demand their right to exist, scratching their fingernails against brick and lime. Completing his circuit of the third act, the heir stopped before a massive staircase leading down into the cellars, from which blew a chill and something metallic. The scratching behind the walls reached its apogee here, turning into a discordant choir that no longer seemed human. He understood that the answers to all questions, including the meaning of today's date in the newspaper, lay there, in the darkness that the servants so feared. The mansion vibrated, anticipating the finale, and 37 immured secrets made the air around tremble with impatience. Only the final step down remained, to where the frozen history of the owner was to meet the living flesh of the last of the line to forever change the laws of nature. The descent into the cellar, which even the most loyal and courageous servants had avoided for decades, marked the beginning of a plunge into a true darkness where the light of the gas jets finally drowned in a thick silence. The steps beneath his feet seemed carved from the very bone of the world, they were slick with a moisture that smelled not of water, but of stale iron and ozone. The depth was felt physically, like the pressure of a water column in an ocean trench, making his eardrums ache from the unnatural density of the air. Here, below, time had finally ceased to flow linearly, it had turned into a stagnant swamp where every breath felt like a final effort before a definitive disappearance into the womb of the earth. Below, there were no ornate collections or halls filled with the mad installations that glutted the upper world of the mansion. Instead, a terrifying sterility of emptiness reigned, broken only by an endless row of massive iron cages receding into the gloom as far as the eye could reach. The bars of the cages were covered in a strange coating resembling frost, even though a stifling, heavy heat hung in the cellar. Every cage was empty, but their doors stood wide open, as if those who had languished here for long years had only recently gained their freedom and were now noiselessly gliding through the corridors of the house, remaining invisible to the inexperienced eye of a living human. In the very center of this subterranean labyrinth, beneath a single dim lamp hanging from a long wire, stood a black marble pedestal. Upon it lay a single notebook bound in leather, its cover feeling warm and soft to the touch, as if crafted from living material. The pages of the notebook were covered in the small, bead-like handwriting of the former owner, and in this text, there was not a shadow of senile madness. It was a cold, mathematically precise report, detailing all the events of the current day in exhaustive depth, including every minute thought and every movement of the heir with the precision of a millisecond. The heir read with horror the description of his entry into the foyer, his hesitations before the door with the stuffed birds, and even the moment when he nearly turned back. Every word in the diary coincided with his internal state, as if the master of the house had not merely observed him but was his very consciousness, directing his will into the necessary channel. The description continued right up to the present moment, as his fingers touched the yellowed paper and his eyes raced across the lines predicting his fear and the desire to scream from the unbearable truth. The entire journey was merely the execution of a long-written script in which he had been assigned the role of the final element in a grand mosaic. The last entry on the open page had been made in ink that had not yet fully dried, and it caused the heir's heart to skip a beat. It asserted that the 37 immured rooms upstairs were not needed to hide a shameful secret or conceal a madman's treasures. The brickwork was a forced measure, the only way to hold the foundation of a house that had long since ceased to stand on solid ground. The mansion was hovering over an abyss, held aloft only by the weight of the suffering accumulated within it and the gravity of those 37 versions of reality that had been deemed failures and sealed away forever. The diary explained that the house was a living anchor that had clawed into the fabric of existence with its stone walls to avoid falling into absolute nothingness. Every room with knives, metronomes, and shoes was ballast, creating the necessary density to maintain balance on the edge of the precipice. Without this weight, the mansion, along with all its corridors and cellars, would have long ago dissolved into the void, taking with it the time trapped inside. The 37 immured rooms were chambers where the pure weight of unbearable experience was concentrated, transforming into pillars for a building deprived of an earthly basis. The realization that there was nothing beneath his feet but an endless fall caused the heir a bout of vertigo, and the cages around him began to sway slowly in time with his panic. The diary dispassionately recorded this state, describing how the victim's pupils dilated and how cold sweat broke out on his forehead at 20 hours and 42 minutes. The master knew the foundation was weakening, and that to strengthen it, more than just brick was required, a living will was needed, one capable of taking upon itself the burden of the 38th room. The mansion required a new consciousness that would become part of its architecture, filling the void with its presence either voluntarily or by compulsion. The shadow from the lamp on the wall began to live a life of its own, detaching from the heir's outline and taking the shape of a hunchbacked old man leaning over the notebook in silent approval. At that moment, the scratching from the immured rooms upstairs became audible even here in the cellar. It turned into a triumphant roar of many throats welcoming their new brother. The house no longer hid its nature, it vibrated with anticipation, and the steel bars of the empty cages began to contract like the teeth of a predator snapping shut on its prey. Every page of the diary was a sentence that could not be appealed, because it had been passed by the very fabric of reality, altered by the owner's madness. The heir tried to close the notebook, but the paper stuck to his palms, and the ink began to flow slowly onto his skin, soaking into his pores and becoming part of his flesh. The words turned into scars, carrying within them the knowledge of each of the 100 rooms, of every bird and every knife, which now belonged to him by right of blood and horror. He felt the house sucking him in, felt the foundation beneath his feet truly begin to tremble, reacting to the influx of new energy. The weight of the mansion now pressed directly upon his spine, forcing him to become that very support that would not let the building plummet into the abyss gaping beneath the cages. The gloom of the cellar became almost tangible, it enveloped him like a cocoon, isolating him from the rest of the world and leaving him alone with the final phrase in the diary. It was written there that the death of the old master was merely an act of passing the baton, and that the newspaper with tomorrow's date had long since been printed in the press of fate itself. The heir raised his eyes from the pedestal and saw that the empty cages were now slowly closing one by one, cutting off the path to the stairs and the light. The last cage, the largest and strongest, was waiting specifically for him, to become the 38th brick in the foundation of the house that hangs over the void on the thin thread of a single human breath. In the climactic moment of realization, the heir bolted from the cellar, driven by a primal instinct for self-preservation that screamed louder than any reason. His boots barely touched the steps, and his lungs burned from the cold, oxygen-deprived air, but the staircase seemed to grow upward along with his flight. When he finally burst onto the first floor, the space around him began to transform visibly, losing the static nature of stone and wood. The corridors, once straight and majestic, started to narrow, the walls bending at unnatural angles and turning into an infinite loop devoid of entrance or exit. Reality behind his back collapsed, swallowing the halls he had already passed like a giant esophagus pushing prey deeper into its bowels, where time and matter merged into a single pulsating stream. He ran past the 37 immured doors, and now, from behind each of them, came not just a scratching sound, but his own voice, begging for mercy in 1,000 different intonations. The mansion vibrated, its walls covered in a perspiration that smelled exactly like the old newspaper from the foyer, creating a stifling veil of printing ink and decay. Trying to find any escape, the heir pushed the last unlocked door at the very end of the winding corridor, hoping to see a saving window or a back exit. Instead, he found himself in a study bathed in the ghostly light of lamps, where a man sat behind a massive oak desk, his back appearing terrifyingly familiar in this realm of living shadows and distorted perspectives. The figure at the desk was slowly tracing letters in a leather notebook, the very same one the heir had just left on the pedestal in the cellar, and the sound of the pen on the paper echoed in his skull like hammer blows. He approached, bound by a freezing numbness, and saw himself sitting in the chair, writing the diary that recorded his every current movement and every convulsive thought. The old man occupying the chair, dressed in the same clothes as the guest, slowly raised his head, and his face began to melt like wax under a candle flame. Wrinkles smoothed out, gray hair flowed away from the scalp, revealing the features of the young man who had just entered the door, creating a mirror trap in which past and future merged into a single point. At that moment, the entire mansion finally revealed its true nature, proving to be not just a structure, but a massive organism digesting time and the human essence. Each of the 100 rooms was merely a cell in the body of a colossal being that fed on human fate, forcing the victim to live through their demise an infinite number of times. The walls pulsed in the rhythm of this monster's breath, and the collections of knives, birds, and shoes were but undigested remnants of previous lives stuck in its folds. The heir realized that the old owner was not his predecessor, he was the heir himself, having passed through thousands of cycles of this architectural meat grinder and turned into a dry husk to sustain the house's life. The horror of the situation lay in the fact that realization brought no liberation, it only completed the process of integrating the new victim into the organism's general structure. The old man at the desk, whose appearance now fully matched that of the heir, held out the pen to him, and this movement was so synchronous with the newcomer's internal impulse that resistance became impossible. The mansion demanded the completion of the record, the fixing of the moment when one version of reality replaces another, so that the 37th room would remain immured and the 38th could begin to slowly grow over with brick. All the accumulated experience of suffering flowed from one form to another, turning the human personality into simple ballast necessary to keep the house afloat above the abyss of nothingness. The space of the study began to densify, pressing the heir into the chair, which suddenly turned out to be the only solid object in this drifting world. He felt his own memories of life outside the mansion fade, replaced by detailed descriptions of each of the 100 rooms and the list of poisons from the 40th hall. The mansion sucked in his history, erased his name, and replaced his functions with those of the caretaker of this grand crypt of time. Every thought of escape was now perceived as a programmed error that had to be corrected with a new portion of brickwork behind yet another door hiding the remnants of humanity. The creature known as the house purred contentedly, feeling fresh blood and new will strengthen its decaying foundation. The heir looked at his hands and saw the skin on them aging rapidly, covering with pigment spots and becoming transparent like the parchment on which he was obliged to write. A glance in the mirror on the wall confirmed his worst fears. From the looking-glass, the same hunchbacked old man he had seen in the shadow of the cellar stared back at him, and this cycle of transformation was irreversible. The corridors outside finally turned into a closed circle, where the echo of his own steps from the past caught up with him in the present, creating an unbearable noise. The mansion clenched its stone jaws, and the heir, now the master, lowered the pen to the page to record a date that had not yet arrived in the world of the living, but had already become his eternity. In that instant, he understood that all 100 rooms were merely a way to distract attention from the fact that the mansion itself does not exist outside this act of devouring fate. The house was an illusion created from a concentrated will to live at the expense of others, and he, the heir, had become a voluntary accomplice in this crime against the natural course of things. Every immured room held a version of himself that had tried to rebel but was suppressed and turned into building material for the foundation. Now it was the turn of a new iteration, and he felt a strange, perverted satisfaction that the order of things would be preserved for one more cycle at the cost of his own soul and time. The walls around began to emit a quiet, satisfied moan, resembling the sound of a sated predator settling down to rest after a successful hunt. The heir, whose face was now finally frozen in a mask of age-old madness, continued to write, unable to stop, obeying the rhythm of the metronomes drifting from the depths of the house. He described how in the future, many years from now, a young man with a familiar face would cross the threshold of the foyer and find a newspaper with a date from October 25, 2030. The entire script was ready, and it was perfect in its cruelty, stripping any victim of a chance for salvation even before they could realize the scale of the trap. His eyes became as glassy and motionless as those of the stuffed birds in the 10th room, reflecting an endless perspective of studies where thousands of versions of himself sat at thousands of desks. The mansion digested another portion of time, and now its foundation stood firm, held by the weight of a fresh self-betrayal. The heir closed the diary, knowing that the next page would be written no longer by his hand, but by his handwriting, and this knowledge was the last spark of consciousness before he finally turned into an architectural element. The house stilled in anticipation, its 100 rooms holding their breath, preparing for a new inhalation that would bring the next victim to sustain this eternal, man-made hell. The finale arrived abruptly, when the heavy grandfather clock in the corridor struck midnight, even though no more than an hour had passed since the heir's first step across the threshold. This sound was not the chime of metal. It resembled the grinding of colliding tectonic plates, heralding the completion of the digestion process. Time, which had previously stretched and looped, suddenly collapsed into a single white-hot point, searing away the remnants of human individuality. The heir felt his own bones begin to ossify, losing the flexibility of living tissue and turning into cold stone and dry lime. Every movement cost an immense effort, transforming into the static pose of a statue, immured within the very space of this cursed study. The process of transformation was devoid of mercy. It began with the fingers clutching the pen and slowly crawled up the forearms, turning blood into a thick mortar. The walls around him set into motion, bricks rising of their own accord from the floor, surrounding the chair and desk with a dense ring of new masonry. This was the 38th room, being born in agony and swallowing its creator to become yet another pillar for the house hovering above the abyss. The heir saw the space narrow to the dimensions of a coffin and understood that his consciousness would remain forever trapped within this stone, condemned to serve as eternal ballast. Stone dust filled his lungs, turning every breath into a torturous crunch of collapsing flesh. Through a scream freezing in a throat that could no longer break free due to petrified vocal cords, he looked out the window one last time, its glass becoming clearer than ever before. There, below, on the alley bathed in ghostly moonlight, he saw a new figure approaching the house with that same expression of hope and curiosity on their face. This was another traveler, lured by the promise of an inheritance or the unraveling of a mystery, another fragment of the future destined to become part of the past. The new guest walked confidently, unaware that every step was already recorded in the diary that was now disappearing behind a fresh layer of brick in the hands of their predecessor. The mansion welcomed them with a barely audible groan of opening bolts. The circle closed with a deafening click, and the mansion, purring contentedly through its hollow corridors like a sated beast, prepared for a new meal. The vibration of the foundation momentarily subsided as the 38th room finally hardened, having accepted a new portion of human will. All 100 rooms returned to a perfect, terrifying order, and the stuffed birds in the 10th hall synchronously turned their heads toward the main entrance. On the marble floor in the foyer, directly before the door, a fresh issue of the newspaper materialized once more, bearing that same impossible date that would never arrive for this world. The printing ink on the front page still shimmered wetly, promising the new guest 15 minutes of life before the final merger with the stone. The interior of the house filled with anticipation. The air became dense and sweet once again with the scent of lilies and formaldehyde, preparing to meet the next victim. The heir, now part of the wall, felt his mind dissolve into the general architecture, becoming part of the whisper emanating from behind the immured doors. He was no longer a man, he had become memory, a collection, and a foundation, condemned to eternally claw at the inner side of the brick. The house continued its infinite drift over the void, held only by the weight of these tragedies invisible to the world. Each new brick made it stronger, turning the owner's madness into an unshakable stronghold existing outside the laws of nature and human understanding. The last spark of awareness flickered out the moment the new guest's hand touched the doorknob, sending an impulse of new life through the entire organism of the building. The mansion shuddered with pleasure, opening its embrace to swallow another fate and turn it into the dry statistics of immured spaces. Beyond the foyer door, April of 2026 began again, but inside the mansion, time froze forever in October of 2030, in the moment where the end and the beginning merge into a single, infinite nightmare. The newspaper on the floor pulsed, inviting entry into a world where every room is someone's lost soul and the owner is but a shadow writing the history of his own disappearance. All the metronomes in the house simultaneously broke their rhythm, tuning to the frequency of the new heart that had just entered the hall, and this was the final chord in the symphony of absorption. The silence that followed was so heavy it could crush anyone who retained a shred of sanity, but from that moment on, nothing remained in the mansion but stone and a will for eternal hunger. The windows were again veiled in mist, hiding the interior decor from the outside world, and only the 38 immured sections glowed with a dim crimson light deep within the foundation. The secret owner of the house had received what he wanted, another cycle of immortality paid for with living flesh that had so desperately sought to know his secret. Now that the 38th room had become part of history, the mansion could afford a short slumber before the newspaper headlines became reality for a new unfortunate soul. Every object in the collection, from the knives to the children's shoes, momentarily shone with a triumphant light, confirming its place in the great design. The scratching behind the walls was replaced by a quiet singing, audible only to those who would never be able to pass it on. The story of the house with 100 rooms continued, and every new chapter in it was written in blood that turned to lime faster than it could cool. The evil that had taken root in this land was satisfied with its new foundation and the silence that had fallen for ages to come. Even the shadows in the corners stilled in a respectful bow before the power of the architecture that had surpassed its creator. The one who was the heir was now merely a fulcrum, a nameless stone upon which this entire grand illusion of order rested. His fear, anger, and delight became part of the vibration of the walls, creating the very background that so frightened and beckoned passers-by. The newspaper in the foyer waited to be picked up, and the letters in the obituary began to slowly change their shapes, adjusting to the name of the one who had just crossed the threshold. The machine of time and pain worked without failure, guaranteeing that the date of October 25, 2030, would repeat here again and again until the last brick crumbled into dust. But that moment will never come, for the house has learned to restore itself from the very essence of human despair. Every indignation, every cry, and every realization of inevitability only strengthened the mortar between the bricks, making the walls stronger than steel. The mansion became a perfect closed world where the owner and the victim are the same person, infinitely changing masks in the mirrors of the 40th room. In the alley by the entrance, the cherry blossoms of April 2026 bloomed, but their petals, falling on the threshold, instantly turned into gray ash. The house waited for the completion of the 15 minutes to solemnly immure the 39th door, continuing its infinite fall upward.